We're back with another episode of Before You Buy, the show where we give you some straight-up gameplay and our first impressions of the latest games releasing. Hi, folks, it's Falcon, and they sent me in to do the dirty work of Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origins. You know, the game with the guy who says chaos a lot.
Chaos.
This is a game that a lot of people were skeptical about online, and it also had a demo that really wasn't particularly impressive, but we still wanted to go into this one with an open mind, because it was developed by Team Ninja, and they made one of the best Souls-like games ever, really both Nioh games. So we did, we went into it with an open mind, and I wanted to like this game, but I'm sorry to say, I came away disappointed. Really, everybody here did. It's not a total train wreck like the trailers made it out to be, but that would have been at least funnier. What we actually got at its core, Stranger of Paradise kind of feels like a bare bones version of Nioh, with all of the flaws and actually few of its strengths. And we're starting off a little hot in this one, but believe me, there's a lot to get into, let's say. So if you don't know, the game's pretty much exactly like Nioh. It has a few additions, but mostly subtractions, and if you've played that game, a lot of this is going to feel similar. How the game's structured is that you select a mission from the world map, you travel through a mostly linear collection of corridors while fighting various enemies in a Souls-style type of combat, you collect a ton of random loot along the way, then you fight a boss at the end of the level. This format's not really deviated from except for a few missions that are kind of cutscenes in disguise, which doesn't sound so bad. Really, that would be a good formula if the game was great, but there are a lot of problems here. But first, we will talk about what is positive. The combat system, it's great. It feels good to control. It's got satisfying power in every action. Also, the job system's a highlight as well. It really smartly combines elements of the weapon system from Nioh with like a classic Final Fantasy job system. Everything you'd expect is here and accounted for. You can be a warrior, a thief, a berserker, a black mage, a dragoon. Like, it's all here, and it actually works surprisingly well in an action format. You can tell they put a lot of work into trying to get that right. On top of the normal jobs, you can eventually start to unlock advanced jobs and expert jobs, which come to be available after filling out the skill trees of multiple jobs before them, which encourages you to experiment with different play styles as you're attempting to unlock everything. It's a satisfying system, and with the feel of the combat, it's one of my favorite things about this game. That stuff works. Another great thing about the game is that it has all these classic remix tracks from old Final Fantasy games. Like, the music is mostly fantastic. Yeah, I mean, you'd expect that from a Square Enix joint, with one notable exception. And this is a really unfortunate one. The standard combat music, it can't be overstated how annoying it actually gets after a while. It's one song and it plays constantly. Like, pretty much all you do in this game is engage in combat, so it ends up drowning out what is usually really great level-specific music. So if you want to hear that stuff, you basically have to stop what you're doing and just listen to the music, which is annoying because while there's a lot of awesome music, you're not really going to hear it unless you go out of your way or just kind of stop and smell the roses and think, let's hear that soundtrack, which I don't know. I've done in other Final Fantasy games. I've certainly parked plenty of them on the world map and listened to the beautiful theme that was composed for it, but this is not that. This is you being stuck on one theme, basically. One more positive I want to mention, it's kind of more for like big Final Fantasy fans, particularly ones that have roots that go way back in the series, like I played the original Final Fantasy 1, for instance. But it's kind of a thrill to see some of the classic monsters animated and moving around in an action game. Like, pretty much every enemy is based off something from a Final Fantasy game. So you see a Tonberry or a Malboro, you see them move around, they fight you in an action setting. It's cool. It might just be a me thing, but I have a feeling it's not. Unfortunately, that's kind of where the positives end. It's not totally terrible from here on out, but I'll warn you, it's not great. Let's just get this out of the way. The story is very stupid. Like, very stupid. Right from the start, it seems like the developers kind of want to disorient you as much as possible with a random jumble of nearly incoherent scenes and sequences, including this laughable needle drop of Frank Sinatra's My Way. It was in the trailers, and it's in the game too. And despite what, sometimes trailers do, Once you add the context of the game, it doesn't make more sense. You would think it would, but it doesn't. So once you get past all that nonsense, you quickly see that the story just doesn't have much going on. Like, basically you play as Jack, a guy with amnesia, and man, he does not like chaos. He's got a few teammates that don't do a lot for most of the story, and while it is supposedly a reinterpretation of Final Fantasy I's story, narratively it just feels like a remake. Most of the story, it's just teleporting from one dungeon to another to restore 4 corrupted crystals. And while in the 1980s that functioned as a story for a video game, it's pretty boring now. And you have to get all the way to the end of the game before the really bonkers twists start happening. And while they're definitely unintentionally funny, nothing that happens is crazy enough to really justify all the boring filler before it. And that's the kind of frustrating thing about this game. It really just feels like filler. Level design is pretty much ugly and uninteresting across the board. Once in a while, there's something maybe a little more visually interesting, but for the most part, you're running around narrow enclosed hallways that connect to larger rooms with monster fights, and that's about it. Some of these places are straight up ugly to look at, too, a step backwards compared to Team Ninja's previous games, which is frustrating because you have the great job/weapon system with great combat, but one of the most important things of a Soul-style game is the level design. Like, having an interesting world to explore is what makes these games work, and this game totally falls flat at that. Like, there's not really anything interesting to find. There's some chests you can find off the beaten path, but the loot's randomized and the level of stuff you get's dependent on which stage you're in, so it doesn't even really feel like a big deal to go get that, and it really becomes a serious problem fast. The loot, it's bad. Simple as that. It's got the same system as Neo, where you collect a metric ton of random armor and weapons you can slot on your character, but now instead of just having one character to equip, you have 5. I tried to engage with the system at first, but the constant deluge of stuff, combined with the amount of characters you have, makes it just way too tedious to keep up with. I kind of just gave up and started pressing optimize equipment and calling it a day. It wouldn't be so bad if your character wasn't so dependent on their gear, but they are, like I said, so dependent on their gear. Here's the real problem. Your guys don't level up in the traditional sense. Instead, you can increase your job level up to like level 30, but that's it. And pretty much every improvement you can unlock from the job skill tree either unlocks moves or improves your class skills somehow. If you actually want to increase your damage and defense, the only way to do it is to find and equip better armor. The whole system really brings the game down because on top of the constant menu screwing around, the game blatantly pads out length by increasing the recommended armor score for the next main mission by a ton every single time, like well beyond what you would manage to get in the previous level, so it basically forces you to play whatever side mission is unlocked after finishing a stage. And guess what? It's invariably the same level design again, except for maybe you go through it backwards. Wow. It feels cheap. At least that was the problem I was having at first, until I realized there's basically no penalty for dying in this game, and each stage has equipment drops above its recommended level, so you can just skip to the next level, run around to the chest while avoiding enemies, and you'll quickly get enough to match or exceed the recommendation for that stage. It's cheesy, but there's also not a lot going on in these levels, even though they're supposed to be based off something from various Final Fantasy games, but most of the time, you're not really able to tell. So just to repeat, you can literally just run through pretty much every level of the game and avoid all the enemies if you want. There's not really anything to stop you, and there's also very little reason not to do it. The bosses, the thing each level's leading up to, should be a highlight. That's kind of a thing with this type of game. Good bosses. But in practice, they're annoying. These guys are built for fighting 3 people at once, which means they've got a ton of area of effect attacks that sometimes feel like they're impossible to effectively avoid. Again, it kind of feels cheap. A lot of boss attacks come out so rapidly and so suddenly that trying to do much of anything without taking damage is difficult, and with this being a Souls-like game, that means these guys can cut through your health pretty rapidly. Clarity is another major issue. I can't count the number of times I died without even realizing it, because the combat can be so chaotic and you die from so few hits. it's sometimes hard to tell if something even hit you or not. The real issue lies in how they try to combine the Souls combat with an RPG. Now, most action RPGs give the player plentiful health bars because combat is so visually chaotic, but here, there's just as many special moves, constant teammate chatter, and particle effects as a Kingdom Hearts game, but now you die in 2 or 3 hits. It throws everything off and feels very strange. All in all, the levels are mostly incredibly easy, where you're cutting through enemies like butter, while the bosses are frustrating roadblocks that are sometimes way more challenging than anything that came before them. Like, the bosses can be a strange difficulty spike at times, and that makes the balance of this game feel way off, like to the point of being unfair. Like, sometimes the bosses feel impossible and sometimes they're incredibly easy, and there is rarely anything in between those. To continue complaining, your inventory is ridiculously small. You pretty much have to constantly go in and dismantle a ton of stuff, which was annoying in Neo, but like way more annoying here because the blacksmith feels pretty much superfluous. You can upgrade your equipment, but there's basically no reason to when you'll just get better stuff in the next mission anyway. Another bizarre thing is the talk menu. It's pure Sonic 06 nonsense. After every mission, you can go to the menu and select talk, which sends you to a shockingly long loading screen to get a close-up of one of the weird-looking NPCs to say something totally pointless, like, "May the crystal's blessing be with you," which shows up multiple times, sometimes in a row. Stuff like that makes this game look like a rush job. Also, let's say they did that in a detailed way in which there were many different lines of dialogue. It still sounds weird. Like, it feels like there was originally going to be a hub area you could explore and talk to people in, but they cut it and replaced it with a much quicker to develop, but much more pointless menu. Like, I guess they took the time to make these NPCs, so they wanted to show them off. It adds nothing to the game, though, and in fact makes the game look worse. Like, it feels kind of embarrassing. I don't get it at all. One last little nitpick before we wrap up, though. Why is this game's file size so big? It's one of the uglier games we've seen this year, and the file size is like double that of Elden Ring. It's almost as big as Horizon Forbidden West, and I just don't know why. The levels are small, there's not a lot of unique elements, there aren't that many characters, the load times aren't short, so seriously, why is this game so large? But when you get to the point where you're complaining about file sizes, it's probably about time to sum up. The frustrating thing about Stranger of Paradise is that the potential for a good or at least fun game is here. Neo 2 is great, so we know what they can do with it, and the job system has a ton of potential, but pretty much everything else is disappointing or subpar. The story is just bad. It's unfortunately not funny bad, because that has a level of charm that makes it worthwhile. It is not that, though. It does not have a level of charm. It is not worthwhile. It's mostly just characters standing around and telling each other what's going on. Like, there is a truly hilarious twist, for lack of a better word, near the end that has to be seen to be believed because of how dopey and out of nowhere it really is. And the way the game tries to recontextualize the story of the original Final Fantasy is lame, to put it mildly. But for vast stretches of your playtime, it's just a bunch of nothing. So, yeah, in our opinion, Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin is basically just a disappointment and a big step backwards for Team Ninja. It's not all bad. I mean, the game is playable, and a lot of the systems work they put into it is good. There aren't any game-breaking bugs or anything, but the boring levels, tedious loot, blatant padding, and all of the corner cutting make this game look less like a labor of love and more of a contractual obligation. It's just not good. That's pretty much the point.
Bullshit.
That's all for today. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. The best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable all notifications. And as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time right here on gameranx.